Welcome back to Only Talk Sports. So we talk sports every single day, or at least we try to. I'm Ernest Jeffrey. Subscribe to the channel if you like sports content. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our video. It seems like every other day I'm talking about the Kentucky Wildcats or the Arkansas Razorbacks, and I wonder why. Both teams basically lost their entire rosters, so they need new players. And today, it's the Kentucky Wildcats landing another big transfer portal addition with the announcement that Brandon Garrison, the former starting center for the Oklahoma State Cowboys, has transferred to the Kentucky Wildcats. I'm going to go over whether Brandon Garrison is a good addition for Kentucky, and I'm going to go over the players that Mark Pope has brought in through the portal so far and what else Mark Pope has to do to build a great roster for Kentucky next season. Now, Kentucky, we know they lost their entire basketball roster from this past season. All the players are either transferring to other programs, going off to the NBA draft, or the players are following Calipari to Arkansas. But that's okay. With a lot of players leaving, it gives Kentucky the chance to be able to bring in some really good players through the transfer portal. But Mark Pope has to make sure that he's bringing in good players and not just any player that he can get, or Kentucky won't have a good roster next season. But it does seem like the players that he's bringing in are really good at one thing, and that's defense. Kentucky was not a good defensive team this past season in college basketball. They were one of the worst defensive teams in college basketball. They ranked in the bottom 20% in almost every defensive category this past season. But this year, Kentucky's defense should be a lot better because every single player that they're bringing in, that seems to be their calling card. Now, I am worried about offense for the Wildcats because Kentucky, unfortunately, was not able to land Aiden Mahaney the other day. He ended up transferring to UConn. That would have really helped out the Wildcats in the backcourt, but all is not lost. Kentucky is still looking at some other talented players in the portal. Kobe Bray, who's one of the best shooters in college basketball. I think he actually had the highest shooting percentage from the three-point line this past season at Dayton. He's looking at Kentucky. So if the Wildcats can land him, that would be a good addition. But what Kentucky has brought in so far isn't too bad. Travis Perry's the only player from John Calipari's recruiting class that has stayed committed to Mark Pope. He's from the state of Kentucky. He loves the Wildcats, and that's probably why he stayed committed to the team. And he's going to be a player that I believe could have an impact as a freshman for Kentucky. And more than likely, he should be in Lexington for a few seasons as long as he doesn't decide to transfer. He's not Reed Sheppard where he's going to be off to the NBA after 1 year. I think that Travis Perry will be a guy that can be a 2, 3, or even a 4-year player for the Wildcats as long as he continues to develop and improve and he is happy with his role so he doesn't end up leaving to go somewhere else. But unfortunately, Kentucky lost all the other talented players that John Calipari had in the recruiting class, but that's why they're bringing in all these transfers. And I've talked about Amari Williams. He's a 6'10" center coming over from Drexel. His offensive game is somewhat limited, but he is a good defensive player, and he is a guy that's going to be a 5th-year senior this season, so that's good to have a lot of experience for Kentucky there. Lamont Butler is a good defensive point guard coming over from San Diego State. I think he is a great addition for Kentucky because he's a winner. He has had a lot of success with the Aztecs, been in the NCAA tournament tons of times, so that's going to help out Kentucky. I am worried that his offensive game's not very good, though. He only shot 59% at the line this past season at San Diego State. That's terrible for a 6'1" guard. Usually shorter point guards are great free throw shooters, but he isn't, and he also struggled from 3, but I think the defense is going to be good for Kentucky next season. Otega Owe, I talked about him the other day in a video, and I think he's another player that is good on defense, but he's better on offense than Lamont Butler. He averaged 11 points per game this past season at Oklahoma, and even though Oklahoma didn't make the tournament, the Sooners did have a pretty good team overall, and he was definitely a reason why they were a 20-win team. And I think when you look at his game, he's got the ability to drive into the paint. I'm still worried about the fact that he's not a good free throw shooter, which is why a guy like Aiden Mahaney would have been huge for Kentucky because he is a good shooter from 3 and at the foul line. But Otega Owe will have a really good opportunity to start next season for Kentucky, and he could be a guy that ends up improving his points per game because he's still a fairly young guy in college basketball. He'll only be a junior next season, but he just needs to improve at shooting the basketball. Andrew Carr, I have not talked about him yet in a video. He transferred to Kentucky the other day. He's a small forward who actually is very tall for his size. He's like 6'10", so he actually could play power forward for Kentucky, I believe. I don't think he'll be a small forward with the Wildcats, but he's coming over from Wake Forest. He averaged 14 points per game this past season, and he's actually a good three-point shooter, and he's a good free throw shooter as well. So out of all the players that Kentucky is bringing in through the portal, he's the best free throw shooter of them all, and I think it's going to be key for Kentucky to have some players that are good at free throws, because if everybody they're bringing in is not good at the line, even if Kentucky's a good defensive team, it could could end up letting them down in games, kind of like Houston. The Cougars were a really good defensive team this past season for Kelvin Sampson, but they were not a good free throw shooting team, and overall they struggled to shoot threes, and they ended up getting eliminated a little bit quicker in the NCAA tournament than they were expecting. So Kentucky, even though they don't have as much talent as Houston had this past season just yet, it's still vital that Kentucky brings in players that are quality free throw shooters so they won't have the same problems as the Cougars. And now the last player they brought in is Brandon Garrison, which is the topic of this video. And he was a former McDonald's All-American player that committed to Oklahoma State. That was a big addition for Mike Boynton this past season. And unfortunately for Oklahoma State, they did not have a lot of success, and Mike Boynton ended up getting fired. But still, Brandon Garrison, he was not really a reason why they were a terrible team. He did improve over his freshman season at Oklahoma State, but he's still a very limited player, just like Amari Williams. But Joe Tipton tweeted out that he is committed to Kentucky and Mark Pope. The only downside to Kentucky signing Brandon Garrison through the transfer portal is that the Wildcats are probably now going to be out of the running for Utah State transfer for Great Osabor, who's a better offensive player than Brandon Garrison. I think the only thing that would have been bad for Kentucky signing Great Osabor is that he is a guy that only has 1 year of eligibility left, kind of like how Amari Williams, the Drexel center transfer, only has 1 year of eligibility left. And it's very tough to build through the transfer portal year over year where you're bringing in a bunch of guys that are only going to be with your program for one season. And then in the next offseason, you got to do it all over again. Plus, Great Osabor probably doesn't have a lot of potential left because when you are an older player, it's not like you're going to improve that much more in college basketball. The only bad thing about bringing in a guy with a lot of eligibility left like Brandon Garrison is he could end up transferring after another season if he doesn't have a lot of success at Kentucky, because the NCAA hasn't stopped players from being able to transfer to multiple schools yet without any penalty. So that's going to keep happening. So either way, there's pros and cons, but I think it would have probably been a little bit better for Kentucky to get Great Osabor because he's a better offensive player all around. And Kentucky's now going to have two centers in Brandon Garrison and Amari Williams, who are kind of both not very great offensive players and that they're better on defense. But it's still good for Kentucky that they're going to have two really good defensive bigs. And when you look at Brandon Garrison being 6'11", 245 pounds, he's got great size. And when you look at his stats this past season at Oklahoma State, he shot 57% from the field, 64% at the line, which that's an issue again. Not a great free throw shooter, just like Lamont Butler and Otega Owe. And he averaged 7.5 points per game, which he only played 22 minutes per game at Oklahoma State. Even though he was beginning to get more minutes down the stretch of the season at Oklahoma State, he still barely played more than 50% of the available minutes with the Cowboys. So he still has a lot of potential. Being a former McDonald's All-American, and he's only going to be a sophomore next season, he's got a lot of untapped potential, and he still could be an NBA player in the future if he improves at Kentucky this season. He's going to have to probably split minutes with Amari Williams, though, down low, because both guys are going to get a lot of minutes. I think that maybe both will play around 20 minutes per game. And it is good that Kentucky has one guy that's really experienced in Amari Williams, but his ceiling's probably very low because he's been in college basketball for a while. But then they got a guy in Brandon Garrison who was only a freshman this past year and still could get a lot better. So that is a good mix for Kentucky to have. He's also a really good shot blocker, so I can't stress enough that Kentucky is going to be a very good defensive team next season. That seems to be what Mark Pope is prioritizing in the transfer portal, because he knows that Kentucky's not going to be the best offensive team next season, because he's not going to be able to bring in some of the best players in the transfer portal because he got the Kentucky job a little bit later than some of these other coaches did. So bringing in a bunch of guys that are really good at defense, that isn't the worst strategy to go by, because Kentucky will be able to win a lot of games next season with a team that limits the other team from being able to score a lot of points. Brandon Garrison is ranked as a top 25 player in the portal, so that is solid as well. And like this article says, though Mark Pope still has several roster spots to fill, the composition of the Wildcats roster thus far suggests that a major improvement is in store in Kentucky's defense for next season. The big key for Mark Pope moving forward, though, is that he's already solidified the front court. He's got Brandon Garrison, he's got Andrew Carr, and he's got Amari Williams. I like Kentucky's front court for next season. It's not the most talented, but it does have some upside with Brandon Garrison. You've got a really good shooter in Andrew Carr, and you've got kind of more of a traditional big in Amari Williams. So it's a pretty solid front court overall, but Kentucky's got to work a little bit more on being able to bring in some offensive players if Mark Pope can. If he can bring in a guy like Kobe Bray to be able to pair with more defensive guards than Lamont Butler and Otega Owe, then Kentucky will have a shot to be a good team next season. I'm not trying to be a Debbie Downer with the Wildcats, but I just know that Kentucky's not going to have as much talent as they had under John Calipari. I know that isn't everything. You have to have a good coach and quality players that fit in your system, and it seems like Mark Pope is bringing in the guys that he wants. But the SEC is a very competitive conference, and there's a lot of teams that are very explosive on offense, so Kentucky's defense is going to have to be really good next season if they're going to win a lot of games, unless Kentucky can bring in a few more players through the portal that are better on offense. And Mark Pope's got a lot more roster spots to fill, so only time will tell who else he's able to bring in. But Kentucky so far has landed a lot of good defensive players in the portal, and that's not a bad place to start when you're trying to build a completely new roster. But let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below about Brandon Garrison, the former Oklahoma State center, transferring to the Kentucky Wildcats, and how you see the front court minutes shaking out for Kentucky next season, and whether you believe that the Wildcats are out of the running for Great Osabor, the Utah State transfer for, because of this commitment, and what else you think that Mark Pope's going to have to do in the portal to help make Kentucky a great team next season. Subscribe to the channel if you like sports content. Like this video down below. Follow me on Twitter as well. Link is in the description, and I'll see you next time.